Wait. Before we start, just want to make sure we're clear here. While this podcast talks about sobriety, mental health, and addiction, it is not meant to replace professional medical advice. Welcome to Sisters in Sobriety.
I'm Kathleen.
And I'm Sonia.
And we're ex-sisters-in-law, brought together in marriage and bonded through our sobriety journey.
Join us as we talk sobriety, addiction, and everything in between. You're in for quite a ride. And our Substack is buzzing with amazing content, from creative mocktail recipes to insightful courses and reflective exercises. There is something for everyone. Don't miss out. It's a great way to add some extra joy and depth to your journey. Check it out. Welcome to Sisters in Sobriety. Our guest today is Taylor McConnachie, the inspiring founder of Embodied Sexual Wellness and Psychotherapy in Simcoe, Ontario. And Taylor is a registered psychotherapist and sex therapist whose work bridges science, somatics, and the sacred.
Taylor helps individuals, couples, and polycules navigate low desire, sexual shame, non-monogamy, trauma, and queer identities, all through a deeply embodied, inclusive, and affirming lens.
So today we're going to explore how desire shows up in sober relationships, the mind-body-spirit connection in sexual healing, and practical strategies for fostering intimacy and pleasure without substances. Welcome, Taylor.
Thank you. It's so nice to be meeting with both of you.
Yeah, it's so nice to have you.
So let's just get into it. What inspired you to specialize in sex therapy?
A big part of it has been my own experiences. I'm someone who has lived with a sexual pain, pelvic pain, sexual trauma, and living in a small rural community, there has been no supports. So from a younger age, I was diagnosed with endometriosis alongside some other things. And there was just really no one that I could talk to, no one that understood. And understanding my own experiences, living with these things, I just became really passionate about this area and wanting to be able to bridge that gap and to provide a safe space for lots of different individuals to feel that they have that freedom and autonomy to be working through their sexual experiencing in whatever way that looks like. So yeah, really it's been informed by my own experiences and just understanding that not a lot of people are willing to talk about these things, willing to specialize in this, right? And I know in grad school, for example, we don't even talk about sex. So there's so many therapists just don't feel really comfortable talking about it. And it's why I wanted to make sure that my practice as a whole and how I showed up as a therapist made it very loud and clear that this is what I do. This is all I do. It's not a side conversation. This is what we're prioritizing in my work with clients.
I love that. I love that specialty too. And I also remember in grad school not learning about sex at all. Now, I'm a couples therapist, so it naturally comes in. But even still, I remember listening to a podcast, and I'm going to butcher her name, but it's Martha Kauppi.
Yeah.
And she did a podcast on how to even bring it up for therapists, on how to even bring up the topic. And I was like, what? Are couples therapists not bringing up sex? What? So, but it's true, right? I think it's such an important specialty you have.
So, Kathleen, would you refer couples that are having sexual issues in their marriage, would you refer them to a sex therapist, or do you feel like you can navigate a little bit
Oh, I definitely can navigate a little bit, but there are some things that are way outside of my expertise. I'm not a sex therapist. So obviously we talk about sex in couples therapy, but there are some things, especially when a couple presents with other aspects of the relationship are okay, but the sex piece is not. Or if let's say a couple came to see me and they were wanting to open their relationship, that's not a specialty I have. So I would refer that to Taylor. Would that be accurate, Taylor, for you? That, does that make sense?
Absolutely. One of my when I was going through to get my AASECT certification, my AASECT supervisor, she had pointed out that, in an ideal world, all couples therapists would be sex therapists and all sex therapists would be couples therapists. And honestly, I really believe that maybe at some point in time that would be the case, because I just feel it's so deeply integrated.
Yeah.
And you know that there is a lot, like so much overlap, but definitely like something like that, like with opening up a relationship, right? It's something I do a lot of work with in my like work with clients, but absolutely that there's like so much of this overlap that we may feel comfortable with. And then there may be these sort of like areas that it's like, oh, this is a little outside of like my comfort zone. And I get that
Yeah.
even as like a sex therapist. And I do a lot of couples work obviously with that, but I also like refer out a lot for a lot of couples work just because I tend to focus on very specific things and then, try to refer out to other couples therapists when we've sort of navigated most of the sexual concerns.
Yeah, and I'm the same. So when we've navigated most of the emotional couples concerns, but there's still the sex piece that maybe there's still a block around. Sometimes it's resolved with the emotional work, but a lot of the time it's not. And so then I refer to sex therapy. So that's exactly how Taylor and I would potentially work. We haven't worked together yet, but
You know of. I mean, it's
yeah, that's true. We know of.
I feel like it's so different with therapy too. Like I used to work as a dentist and it was very clear like what my scope was,
right.
right? And like when it was time to refer out was like it's a very clear line, right? But I feel like with therapy there's like I don't know if am I right? The line is a little more blurred.
Definitely. And I think
Yeah.
that's like one of the challenges too, like with psychotherapy as a whole, is that, anyone can sort of, oh, I'm trying to be like really careful. Anyone can sort of like say that they specialize in an area, right? And so, like, I know for myself, I do a lot of like vetting and getting to know like therapists that I'm referring to because absolutely it's so easy. And I think as therapists, especially therapists starting out, we want to be able to do all the things. There's like this sense of
Mhm.
urgency almost attached to that of like I need to become well versed in like everything. And then you sort of see that some therapists will advertise themselves in that way or market themselves that way of like doing all of the things. Um, yeah,
You
so it
can't.
needs
You
knowledge.
can't do all of the
Yeah,
things. Like, you
definitely.
cannot. You just when I think about how specialized I am and I live, breathe relationships and couples work, I can't imagine. Like, I often see clients who have gone to an individual therapist who says they do couples work,
Right,
and they've taken, like, Gottman 1.
right,
Sorry, now I'm getting really into, like,
right,
For what?
yeah, and I'm like, "No,
right.
that's not it." So, but
Yeah.
same for sex therapy, like, it's I will also say, and this is for US and Canada, it is no small feat to become a sex therapist.
Yeah.
It is very intensive work, it takes a long time, there's many, many things you have to go through, so when someone is an accredited sex therapist like you are, Taylor, I know right away you've gone through a lot to get there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's one of those things too. And I think a lot of people honestly don't know that because again, anyone can sort of call themselves a sex therapist. Like that is the reality of like psychotherapy is sort of anyone can name that. And
Yeah.
it's why like years ago I had decided to go through this process to become AASECT certified because I want to make sure that the clients I'm supporting, but also the like practitioners, and I work with a lot of like physicians, a lot of OBGYNs, a lot of pelvic floor therapists. Um, it's for them to like be able to trust me in that sense too. And so I chose the AASECT path, which in Canada there's like 14 AASECT certified sex therapists all across Canada.
So, yeah, only 14.
What?
In Canada. Like, I just wanted to repeat that so our audience could also realize who we have on with us right now. Like, it is not an easy thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy we pointed that out. Yeah, because I feel like in dentistry and in medicine, it's so like, oh, like I'm board certified in
Right.
blah, blah, blah. And also, we've interviewed, sorry, we're going off on a tangent, but we've interviewed a lot of therapists who decide to practice as coaches so that they can kind of broaden
Right.
their scope, maybe a little bit. Is that right? Like Kathleen?
They do it to broaden their because you like we can only practice in certain and actually in the US where you are, Sonia, it's even more strict than that. So some therapists will kind of let their license go to be
Mhm.
able to be coaches so they can not have geographical bounds anymore.
Sure.
Yeah, but we are getting off topic, so I'm gonna ask
Yes.
the next question.
Okay.
Um, so Taylor, how has your holistic attachment informed and somatic approach evolved over time?
Oh, In so many ways. I remember, and it's not like that long ago, but being like a baby therapist. And I know for myself, mostly because of like grad school, right? Like very like thinking I had to approach things from this very like CBT lens, very solution focused lens. And I realized like for myself as an individual, even before as a therapist, that like it doesn't work for me. So I'm
Mhm.
neurodivergent, and I didn't learn this until I also just graduated grad school, which would have been very convenient if I had learned that previously. And
Yes.
so I recognize like that my brain just, it doesn't mesh well with this. And when it comes to like a lot of like sexual concerns, intimacy related concerns, most of my clients are actually stuck in their heads, like very much so stuck in their heads and disconnected from their body. So I know for myself, recognize that being more connected to my body and taking more like somatic approaches was what was helpful for me during my own
Mm.
experiences. And I recognize that like working with primarily sexual concerns, that more of my clients needed to be connected to their bodies. And it's why I took the more somatic path, took the more like relational path, in the sense of that my relationship with my clients is honestly the most important part of the work that we do. A lot of my clients are experiencing sexual trauma, sexual abuse, obstetric abuse, reproductive trauma, a lot of things like that, where their sense of themselves and others has been really ruptured and broken in so
Mhm.
many ways. And so a lot of our work together is like sort of rebuilding the sense of like safety and trust in themselves, but also with me as like a practitioner and the world around them. And I just have found that that's developed a lot over time by also trusting myself throughout this process, right? Like
Mhm.
willing to come back to myself and recognize, what am I feeling? What's showing up in this space? Like what am I bringing to this space? Being willing to like sit in my own feelings. And again, as a therapist, we're often taught like you show up as a blank slate. You don't bring anything into the space, but
Yeah.
we are humans, and I spend a lot of my time, like I do a lot of somatic work, tracking my own emotions, tracking, my own movements and what's showing up, and being willing to even share that with my clients. That has developed a lot. Whereas like previously I'd be like, no, you don't share that you're like getting emotional hearing their story, right? But like I'm emotional hearing their story. I'm not gonna like pretend that's not there. I think
Mhm.
that's developed a lot over time.
I love how you describe this, that your work is science meets sacred. What does that mean to you?
So I think again, it goes back to my own experiences a bit of like, being passed around by doctors and specialists and being pathologized. Like a lot of
Mhm.
that, especially with things like pelvic pain disorders, sexual, I am going to use like quotation marks here, but like functioning or dysfunction. There's a lot of pathologizing that happens when it comes to sexual experiencing. And so then there's a lot of this like these evidence-based approaches in dealing with that, right? Like a very medical model of
Yeah.
addressing sexual concerns. And I've found for myself, but also my clients, that not everything, like just because someone is experiencing like difficulty in an area, like I work with a lot of erectile difficulties, a lot of like arousal concerns, a lot of desired concerns, obviously. It's not all because there's dysfunction, right? And we don't
Mhm.
always
Mhm.
to be just like naming a problem and trying to fix it.
Yeah.
And so I think for myself, there's this intersection of like understanding and appreciating, right? This evidence-based work and the science around like our bodies and functioning, and also respecting that sexuality is non-binary, right? Like it is
Mhm.
fluid, um,
Yeah.
all encompassing, and we can't like quantify that or qualify that in the ways that I think like science tends to do at times. So finding this interesting intersection of these two worlds.
So, on a practical level, Taylor, so if we're trying to find a balance between, let's just say, like a creative arts look at it and an evidence based, how does your background in like dance and yoga, how does that inform your therapeutic style?
Yeah, it informs it. It's interesting because I never thought some of my own, like, again, experiences, my own background, my own relationship with movement would really show up in the work I do in the way it has. But a lot of times, especially for like, I see a lot of men, for example, that show up and they name that they are experiencing erectile dysfunction, which usually it's not. It's like just throwing that out there. And they've been like handed pills, right? They've been handed these like short-term sort of solutions, and maybe they've been helpful, but throughout that, they've lost their ability to connect with their body, right? And that's usually a big part of like erectile concerns is we feel disconnected from our body. And so I usually bring in a lot of like movement into the space of like getting clients, whether it's like erectile issues, whether it's like orgasm related concerns, whatever, to use movement to just like get to know themselves again, right? A lot of like discovery and curiosity, getting to know like the landscapes of their bodies for the first real time instead of just being poked and prodded, which I know for me, and being able to like use that like intuitive understanding of like how their body wants to move and how it wants to feel, their connection to like those sensations, to be able to just be more like present and embodied in their sexual experiences.
I love that. I can see how that can be so helpful. Like I can just see that how that can work so well, Taylor. Like I just see so many clients that are so in their head.
Right.
And also, I think just what you said really resonated, and sometimes for the first time that clients are connecting with their bodies.
Yeah.
And we're so used to the traditional medical, well, it's not really traditional, but the medical system now of like the poking and the prodding and forgetting like how to connect mind and body.
Yeah, and just like what our bodies are capable of, right? And um
Mm.
I shared like it was a funny reel yesterday on Instagram, and it was really about just like assigning a client with the homework of using a vibrator for the first time or whatever, right? And but seeing like how these individuals who have experienced like blockages or barriers with things like pleasure their whole lives because of shame, because of religion, because of, you know, trauma, all of the pieces for the first time sort of like get to know their bodies and understand what they are capable of feeling and experiencing is one of the most beautiful things ever. And I like feel I'm probably gonna like tear off a little bit talking about that, but just seeing that like all of a sudden it's like they're stepping into their bodies for the first time is like such an empowering thing as a therapist, but also as a person who spent most of my life not really understanding or not feeling present in it.
We're going to switch gears a little bit to sobriety. This is Sisters in Sobriety after all. What are some of the things that sober clients should be aware of when re-entering their sexual selves?
I think again, going back to like understanding our body is a really big one. I work with a lot of clients in different ways who have, for most of their life or for, years at a time, been under the influence, whether alcohol, substance use. And that like substance use really alters our relationship to sexual experiencing in so many ways. Sometimes it makes it feel safer, right? It makes it feel right? Like that I can put some of these guards down. I don't have to be so hyper aware, especially when trauma is in the mix. And I think when we become sober and we're stepping back into sexual experiencing, we have to like be prepared for we are going to start noticing more. And that noticing more can be like a double-edged sword, right? It can be really beautiful. There's a lot of curiosity there, and it can feel like overwhelming and maybe a bit like scary because we've like shut down some of those abilities to notice with alcohol, cocaine use. I see a lot of people who have used a lot of different substances, and I do a lot of work with preparing clients to just be that like noticing more and how to sort of feel safe with the noticing, not having to lean into everything we're noticing, but not like having to push it away either. And sort of being able to just rebuild our ability to feel safe in the like noticing and observing sensations, thoughts, feelings, stuff that may surface for the first time with sex because we've shut it down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've never had sex for the first time sober. So it wasn't until I was like 43 that I was like, "Oh, this is weird." So so for someone like me on like a practical level, how can I explore intimacy for the first time sober? And what is that process gonna be like emotionally and physically?
Yeah. I think, like, getting to know ourselves first before we are applying it to, like, relational sex is so important, right? Because then we have not that it's about having control, full sense of control, but it feels safe when we have some sort of sense of control or at least a container of it. And so I usually like walk through my clients through like mindful masturbation practices where we're sort of building in the ability to be present, to be aware with like our own self-touch and self-exploration throughout the whole process. So the touching, the getting to understand our body, also with like orgasm, right? Or arousal and then orgasm, noticing those things in our body and even that come down from like an orgasm. So I usually will like guide clients not actually in session, obviously, but their homework is to do these practices at home where we're increasing our ability to be mindful. And so, mindful masturbation is such a great practice that will make it easier when we're now applying this to like partnered sexual experiencing. But being able to be present and mindful with our own sort of like solo sex is like a great foundational tool that I think not even just for people who are like sober for the first time, but for all of us, honestly. Most of us, even if we are masturbating, we're not doing it in a mindful way. We're doing it to get from point A to point B. And I think that's a lot of the work and for so many different reasons is to like, bring it back down into this present moment. So yeah, mindful masturbation would be a really big, like is a really common tool I use with a lot of my clients, especially those who are newly sober.
I
What?
thought I
Mhm.
thought it was a point A to point B thing.
Right.
No,
What?
Right.
no.
Right. And that's the like again, the performance over sort of
Yeah.
and
I feel like that's no, but like the masturbation, like I feel like that's why the vibrators are so powerful.
right.
Sorry.
Absolutely. And sometimes all we want is that point A to point B, and that's okay. Like that is absolutely okay. Not every time we are masturbating or having sex, it's to have this like really, present, mindful, connective experience. But we find for a lot of people, especially those who have relied on substances for a big part of their lives, that the dopamine, for example, that they are like getting from substances or from sex, it just changes and alters when we are sober. So now if we are just entering, if we're only having like sex with our solo or partnered where it's to get from point A to point B, we're trying to just like rewire a bit of these connections to sexual experiencing to bring it back down again for it to be more of like a like presence over performance sort of experience.
Mhm. Mhm. What are some common fears or hesitations that you hear from clients about sober sex?
The definitely the biggest one, and I hear this more from like male identifying individuals of like not being able to perform because again, like
Mm.
altered state, right? Like you get used to your body performing in a certain way. And then when we take this substance out, we're in a different state. There's this big fear of I'm not going to be able to last as long, which interestingly enough, and a lot of our like research and evidence points to it's quite the opposite. Usually when people are sober, their ability to perform or to like maintain an erection, for example, it's easier when we're not under the influence, but there's this big fear that I'm not going to be able to perform. Um,
Mhm.
And then another really big one I hear is just like, I don't want to hear all the thoughts, have all the thoughts, all of the feelings, right? And alcohol has sort of shut that down previously. So I see a lot of performance anxiety show up when people are like newly sober with sex because all of a sudden we're feeling, right? We're thinking we may be worrying a bit. So there's that fear a lot as well.
Do you think there are certain fantasies or desires that people previously accessed through substances that they now have to like consciously explore or redefine?
Mm. I'm definitely like
Mm.
100%. I think it so depends on again the reason we are using substances, right? Like the longevity of that, like what has that looked like? Are we only having sex when we've been under the influence? Are we using alcohol to have sex?
Mm.
Like, I think it sort of depends on that individual experience, but absolutely. And I think sobriety brings things to the surface that sometimes it's like, again, it's like beautiful, it can be really empowering, and sometimes it can be overwhelming or even confusing of like, why
Yeah.
why is this something that I was interested in or I was thinking about, and having to sort of like work through that and explore that without judgment and without shame. But definitely I think that happens quite frequently.
Mhm.
So, Taylor, for someone like me who's like dating for the first time sober, like how do I know if I'm actually feeling a desire for someone? Because all I'm really used to is that sort of like substance fueled disinhibition, right? And so we've had people on where I'm like, I don't even know how to flirt sober.
Right. Oh,
I find them like, how do I even know if I'm attracted to somebody sober? Because it was so much easier when I was
Yeah.
drinking.
it's so much easier, right? Just that, decrease inhibitions. And I think like this is sort of where I would usually talk about desire as a whole, because I think a lot of times we think of desire in a very specific way, but all it really is motivation, right? Like that is all it is, right? And so if we think of sexual desire and sexual interest, we're thinking of motivation. And when we are sober, for example, and we're feeling uncomfortable with, again, or we're worried about it being rejected. We're worried about like, how is this going to go? Is the sex going to be good? Right. Our motivation is going to like fluctuate. And so desire is going to fluctuate a lot. But I think being able to notice it and observe it as simply just like a pull, like that's the best way I
Mhm.
use to describe it. Like this pull, this thread of like curiosity or interest. It's rarely this. I'm sure the two of you are familiar with like Emily Nagoski and Come As
Love
You.
her.
Yeah. Oh, I
Uh,
fangirl. Like she,
Oh,
yeah.
Talking
obsessed.
about
So Emily
Obsessed.
Nagoski, so she's like a sexual researcher and educator, and she wrote the book like Come As You Are and then like Come Together. She's also written other books as well, but
I'm
the
actually reading Burnout right now, which she
oh,
wrote with her
so
sister.
good. Burnout.
I'm halfway through. So
It's
good.
so good. But she talks about desire because, again, a lot of us don't have like this understanding of like, first of all, there's multiple types of desire.
Mhm.
And, there's, the spontaneous desire that most of us think of when we think of sexual desire. And I see personally that when people are engaging in substances and using substances, there's way more spontaneous desire
Yes.
because we've lowered
Yeah.
inhibitions. We're less worried about stuff. We're less worried about like, how am I feeling in my body, right? Am I actually in the mood, right? It's sort of then more of what Emily describes as the lightning bolt to the genitals. Uh,
Yeah.
and then when sobriety sort of comes into the picture, we may notice that our relationship to desire changes to more responsive desire. And that's not a bad thing in any capacity. It's a difference. And so I think for ourselves, getting to understand what does responsive desire look like for myself will make it a lot easier to understand when it's there or what do I need to cultivate this environment where desire is now possible, because it may be a little bit more work, right? It's not the lightning bolt to the
Mhm.
genitals anymore. It's this like gradual build that requires attending to at times. And I think for people who are newly sober, it's like getting that understanding for ourselves of like desire may look different than what it looked like previously. And that's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing, bad thing. It's just a difference. And being willing to sort of like understand that and accept that, I think is a really big, important part of like that sexual sort of like debut as a sober individual.
So what happens if there's a sexual debut as a sober individual and there, let's
I'm
say,
in
is
my
just
debut.
Okay. It's
let's
funny.
say
I call it a debut because it really is. Like it is.
yeah, it is. It is. I love that. I feel like I love that. You need to trademark that, by the way.
I'm a
Um,
debutante.
yeah, you are a sober sexual debutante. So let's say you have your sober sexual debut and let's say there's just disappointment. I'm not saying that there would be, but like, let's say there is disappointment that sober sex doesn't feel as like free or euphoric as it once did. How can someone process that in a healthy way?
Mhm. Oh, absolutely. And again, that's quite common, right? So there's this grieving process. And a lot of that is the work I do with clients in different ways, right? Whether it's from sobriety, whether it's, for example, I have clients who have became like paraplegic, like so their relationship disabilities, their relationship to their bodies and sex just sometimes abruptly changes, right? And so I think again, there's that grieving of what maybe things looked like previously that has to happen, and that's okay. And when there's this disappointment of like, this didn't feel like how it used to feel, right? Like honoring that, not letting that rule the show, and that because that's where sort of sexual performance anxiety will really show up, and it'll make it difficult to want to move towards it again. But a lot of my work outside of like navigating and exploring that, like the grief that is sort of embedded in it, is to find these other ways of, again, connecting to our body, finding what works for us. And that's where a lot of the somatic stuff shows up. Because a lot of times when we think of being under the influence of whether it's alcohol, cocaine, whatever, right? What's happening in our brain, like certain parts of our brain are just lit up, right? And so we
Yeah.
want to find these other ways of lighting up our brain in that way that can be like incorporated back into the sexual space. But it takes time. It takes a lot of exploration, a lot of curiosity, a lot of fumbling, to be honest. A lot of fumbling and a lot of self-compassion with that fumbling, but definitely trying to bring some of those things that we did feel back into that space in a way that's like more sustainable. It feels safe, right? It feels accessible, but grieving that it may not look the same as previously.
I love that you just normalize that, like that the fumbling is going to happen or could happen and that that's normal and okay. And it's not expected to be this perfect thing when you become sober and you're having sex. It's your sober sexual debut. I
Right.
think the fumbling piece is really important to normalize so
Yeah.
people know that's normal.
Yeah, it really is in the same way that like when we think of, when we're younger and maybe we're like having sex for the first time, we have these like narratives of what we think it's supposed to be, and we're supposed to just somehow know what to do. We're supposed to be able to have like this mind-blowing sex. Meanwhile, we've never done anything like this before. And these expectations that like the world has of us for that we're just supposed to intuitively like know and do what is going to provide us with like the best outcome with sex, right? Like sober sex, it's sort of that same sort of feeling at times of like, okay, I'm having to really rediscover this is new, right? Like this is having this type of sex maybe for the first time. And just like when we're having any type of sex for the first time, we may fumble through it. We have to learn from that. Maybe we learn like, okay, I actually don't like it like this, or I need this.
Mhm.
And then next time maybe will be different. But if we have that expectation that we're supposed to get it right the first time, like we're just going to be disappointed in ourselves. And there may be like this shame that then becomes a barrier for our future sexual experiences.
Mhm.
I think I'm struggling with that, like for sure, right, Kathleen? It's just been
Mhm.
like one big multi-year fumble,
Mhm.
like since I got divorced. And a big part of it, and I was talking to my nieces about this, not the little one, not Kathleen's daughter, she's 10, my older ones yesterday, which is I haven't had that like emotional intimacy. And I I don't know if I ever have. And so how do you help people
Mhm.
reconnect with that? And then last night I was watching the new Lena Dunham show, Too Much.
Okay.
You
Right.
have to watch this. And so she's having sex with a British guy for the first time. And he's like, this is a lot of eye contact. Is this what you Americans do? And it was like, yeah. And so it made me think again about like the lack of emotional intimacy that I've been experiencing.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's such an important point. And I think again, we can't really even talk about sexual intimacy without acknowledging that there's
Yeah.
many types of intimacy and they tend to go hand in hand, right? And emotional intimacy for sure, especially for those of us who have more responsive desire, is going to be really important.
Mhm.
And so if that is missing, right, it may make it challenging to feel safe and comfy enough to move towards the sexual intimacy part, right? And so again, being able to sort of explore for ourselves, like what do I need from emotional intimacy? What are those barriers that are there? Like where did they come from, right? They came from somewhere. Most of us don't want to acknowledge where they come from because
Mhm.
it's hard, but being willing to sort of like look at that head on and work towards building safety and bringing some of those walls down, starting with ourselves, right? Before this even applies to emotional intimacy with a partner or partners, right? Like, am I cultivating this for myself, and am I allowing myself permission for emotional intimacy to exist like internally? Yeah, absolutely. Like sexual intimacy is just one type of intimacy, and they tend to all go hand in hand in some capacity.
Mhm.
I guess. So, are there specific experiences you recommend to couples or individuals to consciously rediscover what intimacy feels like? I know we talked like a little bit about pleasure and like the mindful masturbation, but what about intimacy?
Well, absolutely. And I think even just as you were talking earlier about this, like the show you're watching last night, right? The eye contact thing that really like prompted me a bit of a lot of times, especially in couples, like I'm going sideways a bit, but I've been with my partner since we were 12. So I'm 34. So we've been together 22 years. So he is my first everything. We started dating in grade 7. Yeah, it's funny when I tell people this because they're like, no, that can't be a real thing. It is. And
Yeah.
so I think like again, going back to like my own sense of self, like the intimacy across a lifetime, right? 22 years of being like my partner, what intimacy has looked like has really evolved. It's really changed. And even now, like I'm someone like I'm a therapist, obviously. I feel pretty well versed in supporting my clients with a lot of their issues, but I struggle so much with the emotional intimacy part, especially. My husband is way more emotional than me. I have a bit of a wall at times, and um, so I have this like personal experience of really struggling with that as well. And I have found that a lot of times, especially for couples, whether it's like new relationships or really long relationships, that we sort of have to again work on becoming curious with each other. And sometimes that's like it sounds like silly. And it's like, of course, I'm curious. Like, I want to know my partner. But we get really stuck in these patterns of actually not wanting to because we're scared to know what that looks like. We're scared to feel that
Yeah.
right? Because it is very vulnerable of like my partner of 22 years seeing this like, this version of myself that I married. That is still scary as shit to me, right? After all of like I have all the reasons to feel secure. We're good, but there's so much vulnerability attached to intimacy. And honestly, if I was to replace that word, intimacy, it would be vulnerability because that is what it is, whether it's sexual intimacy, emotional intimacy, financial intimacy, whatever. It
Yeah.
is just a pile of vulnerability. And so, with a lot of the couples I work with, we are building safety in that vulnerability, which means a lot of times, a lot of practical exercises I do is helping clients sort of share this like vulnerable piece of their internal experience with their partner, knowing that their partner could accept it and feel okay with it,
Mhm.
Could
could
reject it.
judge it, right? Could feel very differently about that person by sharing it, but this exposure a bit to like putting ourselves out there within like a safe container of doing so. I usually start with really small, silly things, like very, very silly, where it's like there isn't a real possibility that someone's gonna be like, oh, I can't be with you anymore. But that sort of vulnerability in putting ourselves in that space where someone can either accept it or turn it away. I do a lot of practices like that. So we're just building up
Yeah.
exposure and trust. And so, yeah, that's usually a place I start because before we can even have conversations about like, what do I like sexually, right?
Yeah.
Or I have like kinks or fetishes and I want to share that with a partner. Like, there's vulnerability attached to that, but we want to start with like emotional intimacy and that vulnerability first because we need this like sense of trust and safety, but also understanding that like intimacy is vulnerable and vulnerable means that there is some level of risk, and are we willing to move towards that, take that chance knowing that we it could be very empowering and it can bring us closer. Of course it could be like very scary and overwhelming and can move us away, but we can't really have intimacy without that risk.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I would say I was with my partner for 18 years. And so I felt like we got more and more disconnected as time went on. So I agree. I think it is work. And then what happens in those situations when you are together for a long time and there's a desire discrepancy?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also I think I'm sure it can happen when people get sober, right? That their desire level changes and their partner maybe wasn't expecting it. So how do you navigate that for couples to talk about like their desire discrepancy?
Yeah. Honestly, I would say that is the number one thing. Like especially when I have couples coming into sex therapy, but even individuals, especially women, it's very interesting. Of women tend to come to sex therapy being like, I don't want to have as much sex as my partner does, and I'm broken. Something's wrong with me. Like, fix me, right? Like, there's a sense of like something is really wrong, right? But couples as well. And so desire discrepancies are just so incredibly common. And the first thing I usually do with couples who are coming in with this like concern of like there's a desire discrepancy, one partner is wanting sex way more than the other, is by like reducing sort of the fear around that, and that like if that is the case, like that is okay, right? Like that this sense of urgency that it needs to be fixed, that's usually where the issue is. It's not actually about the desire discrepancy. It's usually about this like this fear of what that means. And so we sort of call them like first order change versus second order change. And a lot of sex therapy concerns are people coming in with this like first order change, this idea of like, as long as I'm having more sex, we will be fine. As long as I can maintain an erection, I'll be fine. Right. And we have to move towards like these second order change sort of understandings where it's like I can feel safe and secure even if we're not having sex, 5 times a week, 3 times a week, once a week. But reducing sort of this like sense of urgency around fixing it is the first part, and then really just rebuilding these narratives around how we even view sex, right? Because usually if there's a desire discrepancy, well, even if there isn't, most partners have a very different understanding of what sex means to them, why it's important, how it's been conditioned in their lives or reinforced, right? So getting to know, and this is where that curiosity part shows up, being curious of like, what does sex actually mean to my partner? um, is a big part of that work as well. And oftentimes what we see is when we've done that work, like we've reduced the fear, we've reduced the sense of urgency around fixing it. We've had a lot of this curiosity and understanding how what sex means to me, and what narratives I have attached to it, and what narratives my partner has attached to it. We usually actually see a shift so that sex becomes a little more like there's less of a discrepancy, and it sort of honestly naturally happens a bit because we usually see that lower desire partner in a relationship just carry a lot of like shame or guilt, and neither of those things are motivating for sex. Like neither of them. Why would we want to move towards something that is causing us shame and guilt, right?
Yeah.
If we reduce that, we tend to see more like interest, curiosity, safety, and moving towards sex.
That's so interesting. I would say, yeah, I understand that idea that you were saying. I think in my marriage, I thought if we have sex twice a week,
Right.
then we're fine.
Right.
We don't have to talk about it. I don't even have to like it.
Right.
If we do it, that means the relationship is fine.
Right.
We're having sex more than like 80% of our
Right.
friends. And yeah, that's really interesting is how we set these sort of like boundaries so we don't have to deal with
Yeah. Yeah. It's like an
like these.
arbitrary goal, right? And I always ask my clients, they come in and they're like, usually one partner's like, I want to be having sex like twice a week or whatever it is. I'm
Yeah.
always like, why? And I keep
Yeah.
asking as they're responding to try to get to that root where they're like, I don't know. I don't know why. Right. And that's where it's like a lot of that vulnerability starts to show up too, of like, why is this a safety net for me? Right. Of like, as long as we're having sex twice a week, things will be
Yep.
okay. Yeah, it's really interesting.
There is this sort of like frequency, and you find it like it's sort of in like pop culture too, right? When people have that conversation about like, oh, I haven't had sex in 2 months with my husband. And I thought, well, if we're not doing that, then we're fine.
Right. Right. Oh, which is it's so interesting. And like I've had couples where they're having sex like every single day, and I would argue that like I can think of one couple specifically, and it's like the most unhealthy emotional relationship because sex was the only thing that was actually like keeping them together, right? And so if we actually took sex away and it happened, like one of the partners needed like a surgery and sex couldn't happen, the whole relationship fell apart, and they hadn't realized how much sex was actually just like the glue that was holding their relationship together. And that's also why it was so important to them, right? And so
Yeah.
that's a hard thing as well. So whether sex is happening every single day, multiple times a day, or it's happening once a year, we can't like quantify or qualify that at all, that matches up to sexual satisfaction, attachment safety, relational safety. These things are very different. And so I usually do a lot of experimenting with couples of like, let's take sex off the table for a bit and see what shows up, right? Sort of just take that step back. Let's see what shows up, because for some couples, we see that a lot of discomfort and distress shows up because this was the thing that was keeping us feeling safe.
Mhm.
Or we recognize that actually we found other ways to feel safe, secure, wanted, desired, important, right? So now sex isn't as important. And that's also a good, like a beautiful thing, right? We don't want sex to be on this pedestal where it is the only thing that is sort of like giving us an impression of whether we feel good enough internally, individually, or if our relationship is healthy.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Okay, so I think this is sort of an interesting kind of final topic, which is, so let's say someone, for whatever reason, whether they're newly sober or for another reason, they're just really feeling disconnected from their body or from their sexuality. What is a first step that they can take? So let's say because there's so many, especially with sobriety, there's psychological changes, but there's also like physical changes too. And so what is the first step someone who is just feeling freaked out and doesn't know what to do? What's a good first step?
Usually the first step, bring it back to like very basics. And again, especially for newly sober individuals, but comes up a lot with like people who have experienced trauma, is like, again, like a general body scan. And I do this with clients in session because it's so uncomfortable, especially for those of us who have been detached from our bodies, dissociated, right? Like we don't know them at all, right? Like there's just like, who is this walking vessel of flesh? Like, so a body scan, and usually what I do it in session, especially for people who are newly sober or, trauma, for example, they hate it. They're like, I don't feel anything. I don't notice anything. So like, what is the point, right? And that lack of noticing is noticing, right? Like if I can't feel anything in my body, we do a body scan, I'm getting them to check for sensations, sometimes messages, beliefs, feelings that may live in our body. We want to get to know where there is that connection, where there isn't that connection, where we're noticing sensation, where we're not noticing it. So we usually start with a body scan and get into this like pattern and routine of scanning and walking through our body. And so I get clients to do that multiple times a day, whether they're sitting at their desk doing work, or it's like before bed, or whether it's like yoga, whatever, but taking like 5 minutes to just scan through their entire body, to just simply notice without trying to change anything, without trying to fix anything, without judging what they're noticing. That is a really helpful first step in sort of just bringing back this awareness, because without that awareness, like we can't really do much after that, right? So that's like the basic step, because it sounds easy, like it sounds really simple, but I find, especially for people who are newly sober, that it's actually quite challenging. And there's this like desire to not want to do it because either what we're noticing is hard, like we're noticing uncomfortable sensations or like thoughts, feelings, or we're not noticing anything. And that can feel really frustrating. But the more we get into this pattern, the more we will start to notice and the more we will feel connected. And then we can branch off into that where we're now in court. Then we'll start doing like sexual, like body scans and sexual mindfulness practices. We're starting to notice more like arousal and things like that, pleasure. But that's usually a place where I get people to start, is really just simply noticing their body.
And so for people like me, can you kind of like walk us through like a body scan just really
Yeah.
briefly?
When I bring a body scan into a session, especially when we're just starting, like where it's like, this is very new, we've never done anything like this before, I honestly really get people to just sit like in their chair, and we start from our feet, where we're just sort of like, we can be moving our toes, we could be like trying to like notice them, but we're just trying to observe if we notice any sensations, if we notice any like numbness, for example, if we don't notice anything, and we really slowly walk up our entire body. all the way up to our head and all the way back down. And through that process, there's going to be thoughts. Like, most people can't just do a body scan and they're just focused on their body. Like, I mean, kudos to you if you can. But every time we notice those thoughts, we want to sort of just take inventory of them. And I get sometimes clients to write it down, like what thoughts or feelings, memories sometimes show up, writing it down, but then coming back to their body and noticing like their calves. Do I notice any sensations there? Is it uncomfortable? Is there pain? Do I just feel nothing? And walking again back up to our head and back down is like a really basic body scan. But for a lot of people who have relied on substance use, or for a lot of people who have experienced trauma, for example, during that body scan, we may just notice like nothing, or we may notice spots where we're like, it feels like there might be sensation there, but I can't really connect to it enough. The more we do it, usually the more we uncover and the more connected and embodied we start to feel.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I sometimes when I get anxiety, I'll just be like, you know what, let me do a body scan. And I know this is crazy, but it'll be that my asthma is acting up and I just didn't realize it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it wasn't like an anxiety issue. It was just that I hadn't like paid attention to see
Right.
like, oh, you know what, my breathing's a little off today.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. And that's a
I,
big part of it, right? Because with alcohol use, right, we bypass.
oh,
Like
yeah,
we just bypass the shit out of a lot of things, right?
all of it.
And
Yeah.
that's what we're trying to like rewire, right? Because
Mm,
especially like as a whole in general, but with sex especially, right? Like we want to just notice. And if we've bypassed sensations, feelings, right, we have to be willing to connect to them in some degree. For some people, a lot of the clients I work with, when we're doing body scans, we've already built in like a practice that can help us feel grounded and safe. If by doing even a body scan, we just notice a lot of stuff show up and it feels overwhelming. But yeah, it's the like bypassing, right? That has helped us and served us in survival mode, maybe, right? While we're using substances, while we're in uncomfy situations, right? But now we're trying to get to that place where we don't just need to survive, we're trying to connect and thrive.
yeah, it's so true. That is the best advice. Well, thank you so much, Taylor, for coming on and talking to us. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else listening did too.
Of course, thank you so much.
And we will have Taylor's information in the show notes. And thank you for listening to Sisters in Sobriety, and we will see you next week. This was Sisters in Sobriety.
Thank you for listening and being with us today.
If you want to learn more about sobriety and meet your community, find us at sistersinsobriety.substack.com.
Are you a sister in sobriety? Then reach out on social media. We'd love to hear from you.
If you're feeling generous, leave us 5 stars and a review and follow us wherever you listen.
You'll never miss an episode. Until next time.